All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Darren and the worship team. All right, well, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is David Sun, and I'm one of the elders here at Discovery, and I have the privilege of giving the teaching today. Okay. And today we're going to be going through parts of Exodus chapters 2 and 3. And this is week 3 of our Exodus series. So the first 2 weeks, Pastor Steve did a great job talking about a lot of background of where we are in Exodus. Exodus occurs 200 to 400 years after the events of Genesis, where we have Joseph, where Joseph had been in Egypt and he saved his people from famine. And the Hebrews, over those 200 to 400 years, had greatly multiplied and had become a very large ethnic minority within Egypt. And as a result, they became slaves. They became oppressed, and they were used by the Egyptian empire. Last week, Steve also talked about the Jewish midwives, that in the midst of this empire, the Jewish midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, were named for how they showed civil disobedience, going against Pharaoh's decree that all Hebrew boys would be killed. But at the end of chapter 1, we still find out that Pharaoh has this decree that all Hebrew boys will be thrown into the Nile River. And here we get to, with Exodus 2, we get to the central figure of the next 4 books of the Bible, so Moses. Moses, most of you are probably pretty familiar with who he is. A little background, I'm someone who grew up watching and playing a lot of sports, and something that boys love to do especially is debate about sports. And so when I think about Moses, I think about, man, this guy, he really is one of the greatest figures of the Old Testament. We commonly talk about things like who would be your Mount Rushmore of the greatest basketball players, or who is the greatest basketball player? Is it LeBron or is it Michael Jordan? Anyone born before 1990 knows it's Michael Jordan. Okay, it's clear. And so when I think about the Old Testament, I think my Mount Rushmore would be Abraham, Moses, David, and Elijah. So what we get to do today is we get to go into what is the backstory for Moses. How was he formed? How did this central figure who accomplished so many things, how was he formed? Okay. So a couple highlights first on Moses' accomplishments, if you're not familiar with the story. Spoiler alert, he is the one who will deliver the Israelites out of Egypt. Okay. He will be Israel's leader for the next 40 years in the wilderness. Along the way, he accomplishes and performs many miracles, turning the Nile river into blood. He's going to part the Red Sea. That's probably a pretty big deal. He is going to receive the 10 Commandments and the law on Mount Sinai. Okay, so his Hall of Fame resume is set. Okay. And all along the way, Moses, as a leader, will be challenged, both by those within and those from afar. He's going to have many confrontations with Pharaoh, demanding the freedom of the Hebrews. He's going to deal with constant grumbling by his Israelites, who will always say, this is not better than the life of slavery we had earlier. Okay? He's going to face criticism within his own family, and he's going to go through a lot of periods of rejection. So, let's begin with Exodus, so chapter 2. About this time, a man and woman from the tribe of Levi got married. The woman became pregnant and gave birth to a son. She saw that he was a special baby and kept him hidden for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she got a basket made of papyrus reeds and waterproofed it with tar and pitch. She put the baby in the basket and laid it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile River. The baby's sister then stood at a distance, watching to see what would happen to him. Soon Pharaoh's daughter came down to bathe in the river, and her attendants walked along the riverbank. When the princess saw the basket among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it for her. When the princess opened it, she saw the baby. The little boy was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This must be one of the Hebrew children," she said. Then the baby's sister approached the princess. "Should I go and find one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" she asked. "Yes, do," the princess replied. So the girl went and called the baby's mother. "Take this baby and nurse him for me," the princess told the baby's mother. "I will pay you for your help." So the woman took the baby home and nursed him. Later, when the boy was older, his mother brought him back to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own son. The princess named him Moses, for she explained, "I lifted him out of the water." So let's make a couple observations here, okay? First of all, we don't have a Moses story without three women, okay? His mother first showed courage. She defied the decrees of Pharaoh, and she let her baby live. Number two, Pharaoh's daughter, someone who was part of the oppressive empire, showed empathy. She saw a cute little baby floating down a river, and she cared for the baby. And three, with Moses' sister Miriam, okay? She showed a lot of wit and craft. I'm pretty sure she's the one who orchestrated this whole thing. She may have studied Pharaoh's daughter's bathing habits, the where and the when. She played dumb when she was talking to Pharaoh's daughter. "I don't know who this baby is, and I don't know who the mother is." And she actually got Moses' mom to be able to nurse him. And lastly, she did all of this, and she got the Egyptian empire to pay for it all. And I think that was pretty good. Okay. So last week we talked about creativity, creative excellence, and I think Miriam really shows that here. Okay. I like to think about what was it like to be young Moses. Okay. I would imagine that young Moses might have had survivor's guilt. Survivor's guilt is when you wonder, why me? Why not everyone else around me who may have died or are suffering? Moses might have thought, I'm basically the only one, the only Hebrew boy who's alive, and not only am I alive, I'm not enslaved. I'm not oppressed. I'm not suffering. In fact, I have the opposite. I'm getting the finest education. I'm living a royal life. Imagine he might have felt some guilt about that. I also wonder if he had identity issues. I think a lot of maybe second-generation immigrants may identify with this. Did he wonder, am I fully Egyptian? Or am I Hebrew? Am I both? Or deep down, was he insecure? Was he neither? Okay, who did he belong to? I also wonder if, we don't know exactly how many years Moses' mom had him, but I wonder if she felt a certain urgency in that time to pass along to her young baby, her child, his cultural heritage. I wonder if she told him about the stories of why they were in Egypt, the stories of Abraham, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God who would rescue us and would deliver us from this oppression one day. Okay. I imagine young Moses probably felt some conflict. I think he felt he was destined for greatness. But what kind of greatness? Did he want to climb the Egyptian power structure? Did he want to become a great general? I'm sure he could have forged a very nice life for himself and collected a lot of power. Or maybe he saw in himself that maybe he was to be the next Joseph, someone who was not Egyptian, but would rise up to a position of high power and influence and do something great for his people. I think what we can really say is, yeah, he probably saw in himself that he had a lot of potential influence, and he wanted to likely do something great with his life. And I don't know if some of us can relate to that. I always think about, if, especially when you're younger, you're graduating from a great college, or maybe you are that second-generation immigrant, the first to go to college and have all of these privileges that maybe your parents didn't have. Okay. So that's young Moses, and we'll read on a little bit more. So many years later, when Moses had grown up, he went out to visit his own people, the Hebrews, and he saw how hard they were forced to work. During his visit, he saw an Egyptian beating one of his fellow Hebrews. After looking in all directions to make sure no one was watching, Moses killed the Egyptian and hid the body in the sand. The next day, when Moses went out to visit his people again, he saw two Hebrew men fighting. "Why are you beating up your friend?" Moses said to the one who had started the fight. The man replied, "Who appointed you to be our prince and judge? Are you going to kill me, as you killed that Egyptian yesterday?" I'm sure at this point Moses had that pit in the stomach. I think we all know what that feels like. Then Moses was afraid, thinking, "Everyone knows what I did." And sure enough, Pharaoh heard what had happened, and he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in the land of Midian. All right, so at this point, Moses, most people agree that he's about 40 years old, and he had been preparing himself for greatness. And it sounds like at the very beginning here that Moses was coming to a crossroads. He was beginning to see the injustice around him, and he recognized that this was not right. Okay, he was having maybe a spiritual awakening, and he saw the hardships of his Hebrew people, and he wanted to do something about it. So I think we can say Moses' heart was in the right place. This was good. The emotions he was feeling were good. But how does he respond? He responds to evil with evil. He likely thought with his Egyptian privilege that if things were turned the other way, if he had killed a Hebrew, probably would have been no big deal. But killing another Egyptian, he probably crossed a certain line he didn't realize. So he recognized that something was amiss, that this was not right, but he did not respond the right way. Okay. So how did he feel? 40 years into a life of such promise, he likely felt a lot of pain. Number one pain he felt likely was the pain of rejection. We imagine that he may have been insecure about which people he belonged to, but now he belonged to neither. Okay? He didn't have a tribe anymore. The Egyptians had rejected him, Pharaoh wanted him killed, and maybe he thought, well, at least the Hebrew people will accept me because they'll recognize that I was doing this for them. But they reject him too. So he must have felt the pain of that kind of rejection. He didn't have a people to belong to. He felt the pain of failure. And this wasn't a small failure. He likely thought, man, one action, one moment, maybe 5 minutes of my life, and I blew it. I have failed. And there is no recovery from this. Okay. So what is that like? I can't say that I myself have gone through such a big failure as Moses, but I have lived long enough that I had some early failures, so I can relate a little bit. So I'm speaking up here. I am not a pastor. I think that should be pretty obvious. My day-to-day job is I am a doctor, and specifically I am a blood and cancer doctor, okay? And that road begins in college. When you go to college, you typically follow a pre-med track. And one thing about being pre-med in college, I think some people, if they know, is you come in freshman year, and you've got lots of upperclassmen who say, oh, you're pre-med? So was I. But then I took such and such class, and I got weeded out, okay? And I will tell you that 18-year-old Dave was very confident in my academic abilities, okay? And so when they told me this, I also had enough sense, social sense, to know that, like, okay, Dave, don't come across as cocky. So I would nod and smile, and I'd say things like, yeah, I know it's hard. We'll see how it goes. But deep down, what I was really thinking was, oh, no. You just wait and see, okay? Because there is absolutely no way I am not making this. And if anything, I am going to do really well. I have no doubt. And so college started, and the truth is that I did actually do really well in college. All those pre-med classes, I will say organic chemistry might have been my favorite subject in college, okay? I really liked it. And then to go to medical school, you need to take this thing called the MCAT, med school test, kind of like the LSAT for law school. And took the MCAT, and honestly, I crushed it. So by the end of college, I was graduating with honors, and I knew it wasn't a matter of if I'm going to go to med school, it was a matter of which med school. And I knew enough that I should try to be humble about this. But deep down, I was really thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to do some great things as a doctor, okay? And so after college, I decided I wanted to take a gap year. And my goal was, I don't want to use my brain for a year, okay? I want to rest it up before med school. So I got a job at the lab, at a biology lab, and I figured I'll spend a year pipetting, doing different, pretty easy tasks like these reverse transcriptase PCR assays, and then I'll go off to med school. So I got this job at this lab, and I realized pretty early on that I don't really know what I'm doing. And I don't really have much oversight either. And instead of asking for help, asking, how do I do these certain things? I said, no. Hey, you always figure these things out, Dave. You just got to figure this out yourself, and you're going to make it happen. And 2 months into the job, I did not figure it out. Okay, I was spinning my wheels, and my principal investigator, my boss, brought me into his office, and he told me, hey, Dave, this is not working out. I'm going to have to let you go. And he handed me a letter that said I was fired. Okay. And this rocked me to my core, because up until this point, I had never experienced any real failure or setback academically or professionally. And I'd like to say that I recovered really quickly and well, but I spent the next 2 weeks playing Minesweeper on my laptop every day because it was installed. If you had Windows back then, it was installed. While I listened to Bruce Springsteen's The Ghost of Tom Joad album over and over on repeat. And if you don't know that album, it is a really depressing and melancholy folk album, okay? But it captured how I felt. So that was maybe my foray into early failure. Okay. So after this happens, let's go back to Moses. What does he do? So he flees to Midian, and he starts to try to rebuild his life. Okay, he's 40 years old. So when Moses arrived in Midian, he sat down beside a well, In the Bible, the well is always where the action is. Okay, so this is a key moment. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters who came as usual to draw water and fill the water troughs for their father's flocks. But some other shepherds came and chased them away. So Moses jumped up and rescued the girls from the shepherds. Then he drew water for their flocks. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked, "Why are you back so soon today?" "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds," they answered, "and then he drew water for us and watered our flocks." "Then where is he?" their father asked. "Why did you leave him there? Invite him to come and eat with us." I think that this is a really funny moment because their father Reuel sounds like any Asian mom who has adult single children. She's like, this guy sounds very capable and strong. He's kind, he's chivalrous, and if he's single, what are you doing? Don't miss this opportunity. Okay. So we know in Mulan, the emperor tells the general, a woman like that does not come along every dynasty. All right. So what does Moses do? He accepts the invitation, and he settled there with him. In time, Reuel gave Moses his daughter Zipporah to be his wife. Later, she gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, for he explained, "I have been a foreigner in a foreign land." And to give a little context, the Midianites were distant relatives of the Israelites. They were descendants of Abraham's second wife, Keturah, although it was the Midianites who had sold Joseph into slavery in Egypt. So they had a checkered past. And how is Moses dealing with all of this? Well, he named his son Gershom, which literally means driven away, or it could also be interpreted as foreigner there. So we can see he's definitely not over things. Okay. The next 40 years of Moses' life, he spends in the wilderness. Okay. And I think we want to let that sink in. Ages 40 to 80, that's basically a lifetime. He's living in the middle of nowhere, okay? And he's trying to rebuild his life as best as he can. I want to talk about what this time in the wilderness does to Moses. Number one, I think it's very clear that this really teaches him humility. Okay? Previously, he had power, he had influence, he had money, and now he's been stripped of all of that. Okay? For 40 years, he was ambitious, preparing himself for greatness, and now he is a shepherd toiling in anonymity, pretty much in the middle of nowhere. And I think he had to really come to grips with this, that his identity as someone of a person of influence was taken from him. Okay, and I see that in my own life. I had such an identity as being someone who did well academically, and when that was taken from me, that failure, that actually, in retrospect, was one of the best things that ever happened to me in my life. It hurt. It was really hard to go through. But failure really teaches us a lot of humility. Okay? Teaches us that this is a hard world we live in. I think the next 40 years also taught Moses a lot of empathy. We're going to see Moses later on pleading for his people, accepting that they are saying and doing a lot of bad things, but yet he still pleads for them. And why? I do think there is something about Moses going through failure and rejection himself that taught him how to be empathetic, and not just how to be empathetic, but to really recognize that most of us are going to go through a lot of ups and downs, and that's really a euphemism. Some of us are going to go through some really traumatic things in life, to be rejected by the people we love. And those are really, really hard things to go through. Okay? So I think this time of suffering really developed his empathy. 40 years is also a long time to develop resilience. Okay? Imagine the shepherd's life is pretty boring. Might still be difficult day in, day out, doing manual labor. And I think one thing we can learn from this is that this was also the time that was forming Moses, a time of spiritual formation. And spiritual formation does not happen overnight. It doesn't happen in a season. It doesn't even happen in a year. It may take decades. And while that might sound discouraging, I actually think it sounds pretty encouraging because it means we don't have to become something overnight. God shapes and molds us, and it may take many years. Okay. Lastly, I think these 40 years are a time of healing for Moses. He does rebuild his life. He gets married. He has a kid. Maybe he thinks, you know what, this shepherd life is not too bad. There's less pressure. Get lots of time outside. Like, this is actually pretty nice, maybe. Okay. And I think, likewise, our time, also when we are in the wilderness, can be a time of deconstruction and reconstruction, as he was deconstructing and reconstructing his life. I would tell you that I went through a spiritual time in the wilderness that lasted about 12 years. So I grew up in a Christian family, fortunately, but I came to faith, I would say, in around 9th grade. That's when I really understood and felt the call of God in my life. My time in high school was a really spiritual, fruitful time. I was part of a really great youth group. I had several friends who did not grow up in Christian homes, did not grow up in the church, who came to faith in part from my friendships with them and just bringing them into the youth group. And so when I got to college, I thought college was going to be similar. I was all in. I went to college saying, I'm going to be all in on ministry. I want to seek after God's kingdom first. And basically, I spent the last 2 years of my college and the year after essentially doing full-time ministry, even though I wasn't really full-time ministry. I was at church 6 days a week, and so I was, leading small groups, being an officer, leading prayer groups. We had Friday night large groups for college, Sunday church, etc. So if there was something, if there was a ministry, I was doing it. Okay, and I would tell you that those 5 years felt so unfruitful. Like, I can't point to a single person who I would say, oh, that person came to the faith because of me or because of my actions. In addition, I got really burnt out in doing this. And I would say that one of the things I thought about was, back then, I thought that to be spiritual meant that you had to always be somber, or you always had to be feeling guilty about your own sin, because that's what made you really seek after God more, when you focus more on your own sin. Okay, so those years were marked by a lot of guilt. They were marked by, and I just got burnt out during those years. And by the end of those years, when I went off, those years were in Philadelphia, and I went back to New Jersey for medical school, I said, I still want to be a part of church, but for the next 12 years of my life, I was kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out of church. I wanted to keep some distance, okay? And it was also because at that time, I was burnt out, my mental health was really poor. And there were a number of factors at play, but some of that was, I thought that, again, to be spiritual means you should always have this feeling of suffering. And so I leaned into it, not realizing later on that, no, I was just leaning into clinical depression. And when I learned about depression in medical school, I was like, oh wow, the DSM criteria, that was me to a T. That was not good. That was not healthy. Okay. And so for the next 12 years of my life, I was mostly focused on, I got married, Mihi and I, we bought our first place, we went through the whole med school, residency, fellowship journey. We came out to Sacramento for fellowship. And That whole time we were part of churches, but I purposefully did not want to get too deep, okay? Because I will actually say in that time of the desert, my mental health got a lot better, a lot happier, a lot more joyful, and I didn't really want to go back to the mental health that I had experienced when I was in college. Okay. So let's pick back up and let's go back to, so at the end of Exodus 2, we find out that years have passed and the king of Egypt died. But the Israelites continued to groan under their burden of slavery. They cried out for help, and their cry rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He looked down on the people of Israel and knew it was time to act. So this carries on another theme that Pastor Steve preached about earlier, which is through much of the story, it seems like God is silent. And here it's not, and I think it's very clear, this is not like God is just off, on the bathroom break, and then he realizes, oh yeah, I made this promise, I got to remember, I got to do this thing. This is intentional silence. And yet, during this time, we read about the importance to still cry out for justice, even when God is silent. We talk about paradoxology a lot here at Discovery. There's this paradox here that both God seems silent, and yet we are still called to call out for justice, and those two things are not mutually exclusive. So on to chapter 3. This is when Moses was around 80 years old. One day Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led the flock far into the wilderness and came to Sinai, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the middle of a bush. Moses stared in amazement. Though the bush was engulfed in flames, it didn't burn up. "This is amazing," Moses said to himself. "Why isn't that bush burning up? I must go see it." And this reminds me of one of my favorite scene from one of my favorite movies, when Vizzini, Fezzik, and Inigo have kidnapped the Princess Buttercup, and they're being followed, but they don't want to acknowledge that they're being followed. So they're rationalizing, saying it must be some fisherman on a pleasure cruise at night through eel-infested waters. Okay. Pretty amazing moment. When the Lord saw Moses coming to take a closer look, God called to him from the middle of the bush, "Moses, Moses." "Here I am," Moses replied. "Do not come any closer," the Lord warned. "Take off your sandals, for you are standing on holy ground. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." When Moses heard this, he covered his face because he was afraid to look at God. Here we see another paradox. Here God calls him Moses, and he calls him by his name. God is intensely personal. He calls us by our names. And yet, we recognize that his presence is sacred. Okay. And we must have a posture of humility when we when we respond to the call of God. Okay? There is this posture that says, this is holy ground. You are God. I am not. And I think it's important that we understand that position. Okay. Then the Lord told him, "I have certainly seen the oppression of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries of distress because of their harsh slave drivers. Yes, I am aware of their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the power of the Egyptians and lead them out of Egypt into their own fertile and spacious land. Look, the cry of the people of Israel has reached me, and I have seen how harshly the Egyptians abused them. Now go, for I am sending you to Pharaoh. You must lead my people, Israel, out of Egypt." Again, what must it have been like to be Moses? I imagine he must have thought, seriously, God? I spent the first 40 years of my life preparing for a moment like this. And then it all failed. And then not 1 or 2 or 3 years later, but the next 40 years of my life coming to grips that I was not going to do anything great, and I was going to live a life of anonymity. And I'm finally okay with that. I've actually accepted a quiet life. And now that I'm here, now you are calling me? 80 years. That is a long time. I'm 43 years old. This is a long time. Okay. So I think about, I'm going to imagine that most of us have not had a moment where we encountered a burning bush. Okay. But I do think that most of us have felt times where we heard the call of God. Okay. So I talked about my 12 years in the spiritual wilderness. And I'll tell you, it was 2 real life moments that brought me out of the wilderness that I felt the call of God. One was my time during my oncology fellowship at UC Davis. Okay. Something about oncology care, if you're not aware, is that most of it actually occurs in the outpatient setting. So most cancer care occurs seeing patients in the clinic. They're getting their treatments in the infusion center, so they're not really in the hospital. That's true for most cancers, apart from leukemias and a certain other few cancer types. So generally speaking, when people end up in the hospital, it's because they had a major complication or things are not going well. Okay, it's often the beginning of the end. And one of your jobs as a fellow is you do actually spend a disproportionate amount of time in the hospital. And you end up meeting people that you've never met before, or maybe you've seen them once, and you need to have the talk. And the talk is that things are not going well. We may not have any more treatments for you. No, we've been hoping for a better outcome for more time. But we could be looking at the last months, weeks, maybe even days of your life. And this is a conversation I would have nearly every day, sometimes 2 or 3 times in the day. And it was difficult. And I remember I had a conversation with a co-fellow who told me, Dave, I used to be a little bit religious. But now I can't believe any of that stuff, because when you see all the suffering we see every day, how can you believe in God? I kind of just think that this is all really bad, and you know what? I just want to live my life, enjoy my days, and when it's my time to go, it's my time. Okay. And funny enough, going through all of this, I kind of had the opposite reaction. There was something about being involved in cancer care that really spoke to me, and seeing all of the suffering, yet seeing the amount of care, love, hope, courage that people would show. It really spoke out to me that no, there must be meaning and purpose to our lives. We are not mere biological machines who began as dust and end as dust, and that's it. Okay. There is something more. And that spoke to me as Dave. And if there is something more, would you find that purpose? Would you live that mission? The other big event that happened in my life that was a burning bush moment was the birth of my kids. And it's nothing unusual to say that having kids really changes who you are. Okay. When you're a parent, what you really, all parents would say, they want their best for their kids. They want them to be happy, and you have certain dreams and hopes for your kids. You have hopes that they'll be able to take care of themselves, that they'll be capable. Maybe you dream of athletic glory. Maybe you dream, again, that they'll get a great job. Maybe you just dream that they'll be really tall, etc. There's lots of things you can hope for your kids. And when you're a dad, you're strolling, you're walking your kid in the stroller, or they're on your chest like this. I really thought a lot about what is it that I most want for my kids? Because the older you get, the more you realize for yourself, you can't have everything yourself. And that translates into, and it's going to be the same for your kids. They're not going to be able to do it all. They're not going to have it all. So in that setting, what is it that I really want for them? And in that time, I really thought the thing that I want most for them in life is to know and experience the love of God. That they would know how loved they are, and that they would live in relationship with God, that they would be a part of God's kingdom. And if everything else, if it doesn't work out, if they would know God's love, it'll be okay. And I would say those were the two events that really spoke to me and told me, okay, it's time to get back in. It's time to listen to the call of God to get involved in the mission. Okay. And what I would argue is, I was ready for that because of my time in the wilderness. And I think I see in Moses that Moses was only ready to be called by God and to do these great things because of his early failures, of the rejection that he had experienced, and the 40 years he toiled away in anonymity. Okay. And so I would encourage everyone here to take a long view of the seasons of your life. Your life for most of us is not a month or a year. It's not just this one season. And I would say, if your faith, if your spiritual journey is genuine, most of you will go through at least a time in the wilderness. And I'm not just talking about like a couple of weeks or a couple of months. It may last a couple of years, and maybe 12 years like it was in my case. Okay. But I do think there is really a role for that time in the wilderness. Okay. For me, it taught me a couple things. One, I think this time around, clearly I'm pretty involved in ministry now. Okay. It made me a little bit wiser about things. It made me a lot more empathetic about the struggles we go through. Young Dave, most things had worked out for him, and he didn't really know how hard most people struggled or how many curveballs life may throw at you. Okay. It taught me that ministry is actually not about my gifts. I thought I had certain gifts, and I went through times where it didn't seem spiritually fruitful. Okay, the call is not about our gifts. Okay. It taught me, so we have a hashtag, fun is spiritual. And I know that may actually sound very trite, but it actually taught me that that's a very profound theological truth. For myself, it taught me that pursuing God and being a part of God's kingdom could be a life of joy, a life of merriment, and we are not called to be perpetually solemn. Okay? And that is why we say that fun is spiritual is here. And lastly, I would say my past failures and for 12 years, I was that person for whom the church leaders were like, oh, we got to get Dave more involved. And every once in a while, someone would come up to me and say, hey, Dave, do you want to be involved in this ministry? And I would politely say, no, thank you. And now I recognize, I used to be that person who would tell other people, hey, do you want to be involved in this ministry? And for 12 years, I was a person rejecting those advances. But I think going through all of that, it taught me that spiritual ministry, that following the call of God is not about us. It taught me to get over myself. It's not about me. You got to get over yourself. And so I would say here at Discovery, I do believe, like Moses, there is a call. Our mission here is to help people discover and rediscover the good news of Jesus. And our call specifically is, especially for those who may have no background in church, or those who may have been hurt by their prior church experiences. I really do genuinely believe that that is our call and our mission here at Discovery. So I'm going to ask the worship team to come on up, okay? And we're going to go into our time of communion, okay? And as we take the communion every gathering, I want us to remember what this is all about. We remember Jesus' mission and his great sacrifice for us. We are only here. We love others. We accept the call of God only because he first loved us more than we could ever imagine. Okay? And there is no failure in our lives that could ever separate us from the love of God. So I pray that we may learn from Moses' failures, which went through the first 80 years of his life, and that we may hopefully be encouraged that, hey, here was this guy who went through a lot. He took his lumps, and yet God was able to work powerfully through him. So let us pray. Father God, we thank you so much for your word. We thank you so much for the rich stories in Exodus. We thank you for the life of Moses, who teaches us that early failures and rejection do not disqualify us from the mission, and that these times actually prepare us and prepare who we are, prepare our character to be in service for you. So Lord, as we take the communion, would you speak to us? Would we accept your love, and would we accept your offer to join in your mission? And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.